Hi YouTube, Darth here. Just for today, I'm departing from my usual content to talk about a game I've been playing over the last week and a half called Homeworld Deserts of Kharak. This is a real-time strategy game from a studio called Blackbird Interactive and published by Gearbox Software. It's not just any real-time strategy game, as it's a prequel to 1999's classic Homeworld game. Today I'm going to talk about my impressions about this new entry into the franchise. But what is Homeworld? The short story is that Homeworld was a groundbreaking RTS released in 1999 with a sequel released in 2003. A sci-fi space opera at its core, Homeworld broke new ground by taking RTS games into the realm of true 3D space, amazing single-player campaign, beautiful rendering, and an absolutely memorable score. 16 years after the first, we have a new entry into the series, Homeworld Deserts of Kharak. Except it's not really a sequel, it's a prequel. Story-wise, Deserts of Kharak takes place in the time before the original game where the people of Kharak, the Kushan, were still stuck on what was the only planet they knew. Naturally, if you've played the other games in the series, there are a lot of subtle story references in this latest game. It does well to reference them without leaning too much on known quantities. I spent most of my time over the last 2 weeks playing through the campaign, and I played a bit of the multiplayer game to get a feel for what it might be like. Since I spent the majority of my time with the campaign and the single-player gameplay, I'll talk about those first. At first glance, the game feels like what you might expect out of a Homeworld game. You start with one extremely powerful unit. In Homeworld, you had the Mothership, and in Deserts of Kharak, it's the Sand Carrier, in this case named the Kapizi. Functionally, they fulfill the same role, your mobile main base that you use to resource and produce new units. Like other RTS games with their roots in the 1990s, Homeworld Deserts of Kharak revolves around the resource production conquest cycle. You gather resources, build units, and upgrade technology, all the while trying to conquer more of the map so you can ultimately gather more resources and repeat the cycle until victory. In the campaign, just what you're doing per mission varies, but it sticks to that general theme. Like previous franchise titles, all the units and resources you gather in one mission carry into the next, meaning the worse you do in one mission, the more likely it will affect you in the next. In 1999, this mechanic was absolutely genius, and even modern games like Faster Than Light borrow from it. It's a fun way to build gameplay continuity between missions. Additionally, the look and feel of the game also shares some similarities to the original in the individual unit design, but that's pretty much where the similarities end. And there are some key distinctions between the prequel and the original. In Deserts of Kharak, the game is obviously still rendered in 3D, but the gameplay has been reduced to a 2D plane like seemingly every other RTS game in existence. To compensate for this lack of dimension, there is a somewhat unique mechanic for placing your units on a hill higher than opposing units, and line of sight to enemy units matters. These mechanics really don't play a big part in the campaign past the first few missions. As I said earlier, resource and units carry forward from mission to mission. In the original Homeworld, it was absolutely critical to resource everything before moving on, and to preserve your forces as much as possible. Taking heavy losses in a single mission made the next one extremely difficult. No such crunch exists in Deserts of Kharak. The further I got in Deserts of Kharak's campaign, the more I realized that the game just was not well balanced in this respect. As it seems I'm launching into it, let's look at the problems in the single-player campaign. I'll talk about multiplayer afterwards. The campaign was a huge strength of 1999's Homeworld. While Deserts of Kharak does a wonderful job of storytelling during its campaign, the actual missions and balance of the campaign are pretty lackluster. As I was previously saying, the campaign is not balanced well at all for players who plan carefully, do not lose many units, and resource effectively. I played the game on the middle tier of difficulty, normal, but unless you've never touched an RTS before, I might recommend going all the way to the classic difficulty to get the maximum mileage out of the game. Overall, the missions mostly revolved around an objective of smash desert base, and while that's pretty typical fare for a real-time strategy game, I was hoping to see more variety. As well, the objectives themselves were pretty hand-holding for the majority of the campaign and didn't let the player come to strategic conclusions themselves. But it was actually in my best interest to completely ignore what the mission wanted me to do and simply focus on keeping my units safe and resources gathering as much as possible. Very few missions had any time pressure elements at all. At the end of the campaign, I ended up with a laughably huge amount of resources that I never ended up needing. It made the game extremely trivial as long as I ignored what the game told me to do and instead focused on clearing the map of enemies and resources. Aside from a single specifically scripted defensive mission, at no point during the campaign did I feel any form of pressure. This feeling was not aided by the fact that the campaign AI doesn't exist. I played a few skirmish games where the skirmish AI seemed to be challenging enough, but only because it cheated relentlessly. However, the campaign AI was just truly awful. Every attack in the campaign is scripted on a timer, follows the same routes, and generally brings the exact same units. The AI makes terrible decisions during battles and mostly just mashes units into you. As long as you don't provoke the mission to advance the objectives, you're completely safe from anything unpredictable. With a handful of exceptions, the missions became long, grindy, and boring. The campaign AI rarely ever gathers resources and almost never challenges you in a meaningful way. Compare this to the original Homeworld campaign where you were in a constant race against the AI gobbling up resources on the map and trying to constantly harass you and destroy you. That bit about gobbling up resources was extremely critical in providing real pressure against you in the original campaign, something that is clearly lacking in this game. And a lot can be attributed to the extremely underwhelming campaign and single-player AI. The campaign is also quite short. Make no mistake about it, you could easily be done with this game in 10 hours. I ended up spending about 18 hours playing the campaign because I painstakingly coddled and replayed a few missions just to see how much I could exploit their designs. The campaign itself is 13 missions long, 3 shy of the original Homeworld's 16 missions. And the campaign is absolutely trivial compared to my gold standard of Warcraft 3's 37 mission campaign, or even the 29 missions of the more recent StarCraft 2 Wings of Liberty. By the numbers alone, it pales in comparison. And for missions that all take place in a single tile set in the desert, it feels very short and samey. Compare this to other titles and it just doesn't measure up. Outside the campaign, there are only 6 skirmish maps in the game, and don't expect to have a long life out of playing against a mediocre AI in skirmish mode. Let's talk about some bugs. While I don't think the campaign was particularly buggy, there were at least 2 missions I literally broke by doing the objectives out of order, and another mission whereby because I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, I managed to essentially die in a cutscene. Though it did provide some hilarious rage fuel in what was otherwise a drawn-out resource hunt. Oh, Jesus. Oh, this is gonna be hilarious. Come on, seriously, give me control! Oh my god! Wow, can you say f***ing stupid lame? What the f*** was I supposed to do? How am I supposed to know this is gonna come through here? Oh my god! Wow! Can you say bad map design? Holy... These seemed like pretty obvious problems with these maps and continued to point to the campaign feeling like a freshman effort in the gameplay department. But those are really the low points for the campaign. So what were the high points? Homeworld Deserts of Kharak is a very pretty game. For being a game that has map after map of deserts, it manages to make them look great. I ended up spending a lot of time in orbital view, so I didn't get a chance to observe the individual details of the units very often, but from time to time I did zoom in to have a closer look. The audio is also a nice part of the experience, and while I don't think the music quite matches up to the original Homeworld's award-winning soundtrack, there are a good number of very catchy tunes in Deserts of Kharak. Another thing the game does well is pacing. The campaign does manage to introduce concepts, technologies, and strategies to the player in a good clip. At no point did I feel like I was overwhelmed or confused about what was being asked in the missions. In fact, I actually felt like the campaign could have stepped it up in a couple of places as mastery was never really required before the next thing was introduced. The overall effect was that each mission felt like it was introducing the next facet of the game in a logical order, even if the mission itself wasn't very interesting. Storytelling is where the game hits the same great stride as its predecessors. The campaign story is well told and interesting enough, if done a bit of a disservice by the actual gameplay revolving around the story. Again, it made me wish the campaign was a bit longer so that some of these story beats could be expanded on. It makes me realize how nice it would have been to have the same sort of alternative perspective gameplay that Warcraft 3 does so well. In that game, you played one faction and then the next in a very interesting storytelling dynamic. In Deserts of Kharak, the villains seem interesting, but I don't get a chance to understand their motivations very well before I'm blowing them up. Furthermore, there's an entire faction of gameplay that is completely unused. Maybe that's fine, as the game does a very wonderful job of filling in the blanks in the Homeworld franchise while still maintaining its own unique story. It doesn't fall into the trap of prequel storytelling where everything is a known quantity and nobody cares. I'm looking at you, Star Wars. Overall, I felt like the campaign was a few steps short of being great. Maybe a few missions to be precise, but it was still quite playable and completable. Honestly, if the campaign doubled in length and the second half really opened up the challenge, I think this might have been a home run of a game. While acting as sort of one long tutorial, the missions were a little too samey. The Homeworld look and feel is there though, and even by the time I finished the last mission, I felt like I had connected with an old friend. Even if that friend had maybe gotten a little lazy and fat in the years we haven't seen each other. Lackluster single player aside, how is the multiplayer experience? Well, unfortunately, I've only been able to play a handful of games. The Deserts of Kharak multiplayer community suffers from a severe lack of players. When I checked over the weekend, mind you this is the second weekend after release, there were only 500 players online on Steam. That's in the world, and not necessarily playing multiplayer. Because the multiplayer is region locked, even if they were all playing multiplayer, I wouldn't see many of them. So the automatic matchmaking was pretty much a flop, but I was able to find a couple of public games that gave me a taste of what the multiplayer is like. And it's pretty much what I'd expect from a game with its roots in the 1990s. The setting is interesting, but the gameplay is not anything new. It plays competently, but I can't imagine spending any time mastering it. And unfortunately, because we're not in space for this game, there are two components that would make this game stand out that are missing: the 3D space and the concept of hyperspace. In 1999's Homeworld, you could teleport nearly any unit to just about anywhere on the map, provided you had gathered enough resources. This could create very interesting opportunities for surprise attacks and added a whole new layer of strategy which, in addition to the 3D space, made the game feel very different in a sea of RTS clones. Flash forward to today, where we have a game that would be nearly indistinguishable from those very RTS clones. And I think that's really where Deserts of Kharak fails, in that it does not meet the minimum bar required in 2016 to stand out from the crowd. Real-time strategy games aren't exactly common anymore, and their core audience I think has been wooed by the MOBA genre. What does remain is held together by Company of Heroes, Dawn of War, and StarCraft. Three games which I think hold a superior polish level and level of innovation over Homeworld. But what about you? If you're an insatiable fan of the Homeworld series, this game might be for you. It's certainly competent enough at what it does, tells its story well, and feels like spending time with an old friend. But keep in mind that it's a major departure from the foundations of the franchise. If you're not a Homeworld fan or an RTS fan, this probably isn't the game for you. It simply doesn't do enough to make it a share-worthy experience for the uninitiated. However, if you've never played the original Homeworld, I'd highly recommend picking up that game. It's a classic and simply a masterpiece. The remastered edition is available on Steam. That's it for this video about Homeworld Deserts of Kharak. Have you tried playing this game? What did you think? Did you play the original? What is your favorite strategy game of all time? Be sure to leave a comment below letting me know. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, YouTube.